On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover feast.
The first Passover, as many of you know, was talked about in Exodus. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story because we'll be here all night. But Moses gave the elders of Israel instructions about how they were to observe the Passover and observe the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Now, there are a lot of folks who say, well, isn't the Feast of the Unleavened Bread the same as the Passover? No. The Feast of the Unleavened Bread is a 7-day feast. Passover is just one night in that 7-day celebration. So Moses has to give the elders of Israel instruction, and all of the Israelites instruction on how they are to commemorate the night of the Passover. These are his instructions to the elders. Now, go and select lambs for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood of the lamb that is in the basin, and touch the blood to the lintel and to the doorposts of your home. Don't leave the house until morning. During the night, the Lord will pass through and strike down the Egyptians. When the Lord sees the blood on the lintel of your doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door to your dwelling and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you down. You shall observe this rite as a perpetual ordinance for you and your children. Perpetual meaning continue. Right. When you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he was promised, you shall keep this observance. And when your children ask you, "What do you mean by this observance?" you shall say, "It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord. For God passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses." And the people bowed down and worshipped. Leviticus also talks about it. Leviticus says, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month. Now, don't think about our first month. You have to think about Nisan. That's the first month, Nisan. The 14th day of Nisan. At twilight, there shall be a Passover offering to the Lord. And on the 15th day of the same month is the festival of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall not work at your occupations. For 7 days you shall present the Lord's offerings by fire. On the 7th day there shall also be a holy convocation, and you shall not work at your occupations. So in Mark's Gospel, just preceding the preparations for the Passover, Jesus has spent the evening, 2 days before the Passover. Jesus spent the evening at the house of Simon the leper. And there he was honored by the woman with the alabaster flask, who took the very expensive perfume and poured it over his head and anointed him and washed his feet with it. And she was criticized by those who were embarrassed by what she was doing, saying that she should have used that expensive perfume for the benefit of the poor. But it was also on that occasion, on that very same evening, as he was having dinner with Simon the leper, that Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased, and they promised to give Judas money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray Jesus. So 2 days before the Passover, this honoring and this undercurrent of betrayal have begun to kind of fester in the midst of Jesus and his disciples. He sent 2 of his disciples, saying, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there.' So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as Jesus had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal according to Moses' instructions. When it was evening, he came with the 12, and when they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, 'Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is sitting eating with me.' They began to be distressed and to say to him one after another, 'Surely not I.' And he said to them, 'It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born.' While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, and he gave it to them, and he said, 'Take, this is my body.' Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. And he said to them, 'This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God.'" Thus ends the reading of the word.
Thanks be to God.
In numerous Hebrew scriptures, the children of Israel are reminded to honor the Passover event and to remember it as part of that feast of the unleavened bread. As Jesus and his disciples are fully aware, there are specific rituals that must be followed, that must be in place, that have been in place for centuries, commemorating God's mighty act of liberation and salvation of the Jews. There are rituals of preparation, because on the night of the Passover, all who had been enslaved in Egypt were instructed to be prepared to leave, to be dressed and ready to go. Every family was to have sacrificed their unblemished lamb, spreading that blood of the lamb on the doorposts around their homes. It was the blood of the lamb that was the signal to God that the person who lived in that dwelling was one of the liberated, not one to be destroyed. This is an 8-day festival then of liberation. Through all of the celebrating, God's people are ever giving thanks for their freedom, remembering God's mighty acts in their history. On the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, likely hoping that they have come to Jerusalem to participate in the feast as is required of every Jewish male and then go home, the disciples asked Jesus, "So, where do you want to do this? Where do you want to have us make the preparations to follow the instructions of Moses for you to eat the Passover?" Mark's narrative leaves no doubt that Jesus is this night celebrating the Passover meal with his disciples. Mark designates this night clearly as the first day of the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. The remembrance of that Passover is just one night in the 7-day festival. It is the feast, then, of the Passover lamb. So their preparations are going to buy the unblemished sacrificial lamb, having it sacrificed in the temple by the appropriate religious representative, then roasting every portion of that lamb, every part, and then they will have lamb for dinner tonight, freshly sacrificed in the temple. It is most important for us to understand Mark's intentional symbolism. New days in Judaism begin at dusk. So when they gather for the meal, it is a new day. It is no longer the 14th day of the month. The day before Passover, it is now the 15th day. It is now the beginning of the Passover. In our system of days and dates, I know I'm going to confuse you, the Sabbath begins on Friday evening. Tomorrow at dusk, then, just 24 hours away, the Sabbath begins. The disciples, along with everyone else in Jerusalem, are celebrating the liberation of their ancestors from slavery. They are today setting up an event dinner to give thanks and praise to God for God's wondrous deeds and mighty acts. The Samaritans and the Judeans both celebrate the feast. They just do it in different places. Let us remember that tonight they commemorate this. They commemorate this Passover even as they have lived under the thumb of the Romans for decades, whose oppression and tyranny could be as weighty, capricious, and unpredictable as that of the regimes of Hitler and Mussolini in Germany and Italy in the 1930s and 40s, or the regime of Idi Amin from 1971 to 1979. Even in this oppressive political climate, they will commemorate God's freedom of God's people. In this political climate, betrayal was not out of the ordinary. Everyone tends to think that Judas' betrayal of Jesus to the religious authorities was a special, pivotal, even an isolated event. No, my friends, we don't have very far to look back in our own history to a time when the betrayal of a friend or even a stranger was what people did to rescue themselves from the tyranny of McCarthyism. When Senator McCarthy began his anti-communist crusade, people in this free land turned on each other out of fear and intimidation. Thousands of Americans were accused of being communist and communist sympathizers, and they became the subject of aggressive investigations and questioning before government and private industry panels, committees, and agencies. The primary targets of such suspicions were government employees, those in the entertainment industry, educators, and even union activists. Today, McCarthyism defines the practice of making accusations of subversion or treason without proper regard for evidence. Jesus was about his work when the Emperor Tiberius Caesar ruled the Mediterranean world. He was an unpopular emperor and made himself even more unpopular when he appointed the infamous prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. After Tiberius died, things got even worse when his nephew Caligula became emperor. He expected to be worshipped as a god and threatened death and destruction to anyone who took issue with his plans. The behavior of Judas and the religious authorities in Jesus' day were likely more influenced by this former day McCarthy-esque political climate than by any individual dislike of Jesus. Their decisions and their actions had more to do with self-preservation than anything else. In their eyes, Jesus' agenda was to stir up trouble, to create a hornet's nest of controversy. History attests to these political tensions, for it wasn't too many years in Judea's future that Rome destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem to punish and quell the Jewish revolt in the year 66. My intention in giving you this political background is to broaden your perspective regarding the events of this evening with Jesus. The festival of the unleavened bread was a huge event. The population of the city of Jerusalem swelled, much like that of Fort Lauderdale or Palm Springs during spring break. It wouldn't take much to set the crowds on edge. It wouldn't take much to start a riot. Commentators have remarked, and it is important to note, that Mark's narrative is not a narrative of an institutionalized practice. It's not like that found in John's Gospel or in Paul's letter to the church at Corinth. There is no Eucharistic liturgy. There's no Eucharistic verbiage in Mark's narrative. I don't know if you picked that up when I read it to you. Yes, Mark's Jesus re-signifies the bread and the cup, but he doesn't instruct the disciples to ritualize the event. This is a very intimate moment that Jesus has with his disciples. There are no instructions given to them to do this in remembrance of me. It's not there in the text. Jesus is most definitely with his disciples celebrating liberation. As the master of the feast, he speaks the traditional benediction over the unleavened bread and the cup of wine. The traditional benedictions, which are, "Blessed art thou, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. And blessed art thou, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine." In his narrative, Mark reports that Jesus broke bread and gave it to the disciples after speaking these benedictions. He passes the very familiar bread to them in a very familiar fashion, as they have done it at every Passover meal. I imagine that it is while they begin to eat the bread that Jesus says, "Take, this is my body." Those disciples who were paying attention stop mid-chew and don't know what to do with that lump of bread in their mouths. Suddenly, their mouths are dry. They're all looking at Jesus, unable to swallow for fear of choking, when Jesus blesses the cup of wine, and passes it around to them. All of the disciples take a drink from the cup, anxious and thankful at the same time to have something to wash down the bread that is still stuck in their mouths. Mark tells us it is only after each in turn has taken a drink from the cup that Jesus says to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." On this night, all are remembering the blood of the Passover, that promise from God that all who marked their doorposts in Egypt with the blood of the unblemished lamb would be spared, saved from the destroyer who passed through Egypt and came to kill firstborn children of both the animals and children of the Egyptians. Mark's Jesus has given the bread and the cup additional meaning. Jesus, like the lamb, is the sacrifice for God's people. And the cup is the new covenant sign, which is poured out no longer for a few and a particular group of people, but for many. Every disciple in the room, all 12, including the betrayer, including the one who will deny Jesus 3 times, and all the rest who will desert him and flee this very night, receive this cup. Mark's use of the word cup very intentionally in verse 23 echoes Jesus' declaration and the question he he posed to James and John in chapter 10 of Mark's Gospel. They both come to Jesus and they say, we want to sit on your right and your left hand in your glory. And Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus asked 3 times, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet do not what I want, but what you want. As one scholar wrote, paradoxically, the cup is both the cup of death and the cup of salvation. It is the symbol of God's new covenant with humankind. Finally, in Mark's verse 25, Jesus announces, truly I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it in the kingdom of God. And this announcement heralds the heavenly banquet and the coming of the Son of Man in his glory. Perhaps as his disciples remembered this night, they remembered this declaration and this promise. This moment of communion with his disciples was also Jesus' promise to them, that they would be together again, communing together again one day. In early Christian traditions, it was believed that the second coming of Christ in victory would occur in the midst of the commemoration of Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. The church may no longer be conscious of such a belief in its past. We may have left behind the idea of Jesus coming again in the midst of our partaking of the Lord's Supper, when the body of Christ split into splinter groups, arguing over the ritual and its meaning. But I think this is precisely what we mean when we ask God's blessing upon the elements and continued blessing upon us all, just before we partake of the bread and the cup. He came and found the disciples sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and he prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him.
He came a third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. And with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away unguarded. So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, Rabbi, and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to them, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not